Hello, hello! I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write, where I give questionable writing advice through running metaphors. Mile 13 is a painful one, as your body becomes its own antagonist. So accordingly, episode 13 is all about the villains. Before we get to my original points for this episode, I'm going to pull back the curtain and share my own personal villain story. Yesterday, during a 12-mile run, I experienced a new first for my life. Halfway through the run, nature took a turn for the worse, and I kept going. That was a mistake. I bit it down some stairs, bruised my back pretty badly, dislocated a finger, and I kept going. My pinky was flopping around like a worm at the end of a fish hook, so I popped that back into place, ran the 4 miles to finish out the run, shortened it down to 10 miles because I was definitely hurting and knew enough about me to call it in, and I have been paying for that mistake since then. All that to say, use better judgment than I did. Moments in life that look dangerous, you might want to try and avoid. There is nothing wrong with ending a run early when the weather turns. Some real life villains are not worth defeating. Back to your regularly scheduled episode. Warning, mild spoilers ahead for the Marvel movies, One Piece, and The Lord of the Rings. Though if you're caught up with the past 3 or so years, you'll be fine. Stories lose out when the hero's nemesis lacks basic human traits, commits evil for the sake of doing evil, has goals of world domination for some unknown reason, or has no conceivable goals at all. Humanizing villains, even those who aren't human, is imperative to avoid writing the Mwahaha evil baddies. I have a strategy that helps write the dynamic villains I love to hate. In an early stage of one of my stories, I was writing everything from a single, biased narrator's point of view. This led to the villain appearing to be a one-dimensional character. As I didn't know the direction I wanted to take with that story, I played around with a mixed bag of ideas. One of my more creative ideas, by which I mean overly complicated efforts, was to swap the main character and initial protagonist. Instead of being a victim, the protagonist was the one causing harm to others, albeit accidentally. That got me working on a more fleshed out background for the initial antagonist. As a whole, these additions made my villain more relatable, or at least less of a mindless evildoer. To give a good example, the Green Goblin from the OG Spider-Man movie was purely crazy. He had limited motives aside from wanting to maintain his company, and it's only through an amazing performance by Willem Dafoe that the over-the-top acting worked for the villain. Staying in the Marvel Universe, though not the same cinematic Marvel Universe, the Red Skull is another Mwahaha villain who remains static across his movie. His primary drive seemed to be obtaining more power to become more powerful, which served to move the plot along. Marvel is notorious for having weak villains, which start blending together for me. I mean, think of the number of Marvel movie villains whose driving force is to steal the main character's weapon, power, or armor, which they then use against them in a final battle. Due to the similar nature of their villains, on a basic level, there isn't much of a difference between the showdowns in Iron Man, Iron Man 3, The Incredible Hulk, Captain America the First Avenger, or Ant-Man, aside from the changing set pieces. Now think of Loki. He started as an interesting villain and went through considerable transformation from there. In the first Thor movie, he was a devious villain who had clear ambitions to earn the respect of his adopted family. By Endgame, he has evolved into a reasonably honorable anti-hero who still retained his devious roots. As such, he is remembered long after his movie appearances, which is one of many reasons why he's a fan favorite. Dynamic and conflicted villains become icons, whereas single-minded adversaries are soon forgotten. Keep in mind, no rule is set in stone, and certain genres can have less fleshed out villains than others. Looking at you, high fantasy. How do you write a good villain? Here are my 7 tips to create those memorable ones. Starting with number 1, make them believable. Due to most stories' narrative points of view focusing on the main characters, the villains' motives are difficult to convey. This limits the amount of time available to justify their actions, and often reduces them down to a lowest common denominator of generalizations. The worst offenders include a brief momentary flashback showing a villain being abused, leading to them never wanting to feel weak and vulnerable again. In my opinion, the villains don't become well-rounded by these additions to their backstory. They remain as plot devices to move the heroes forward. I don't mean to diminish victims in real life or the trauma they've experienced. My point is that movies use these moments as shorthand to justify why someone would want to take over the world, which doesn't line up for me. Within the world of One Piece, Doflamingo is a believable villain, and in some ways I can understand his actions even if I disagree with the atrocities he commits. Born as a royal, his father rebuked their godlike worship and renounced their status. This naive approach led to the family's downfall, torture, and death. Thus, Doflamingo wants to rule and retain that rule by any means necessary, for the purpose of regaining the power he lost. He is a brutal monster, an unstable dictator, and a dynamic genius villain.
Hey, Future Ben here. I wanted to expand on why Doflamingo was such a well-crafted villain for me. We weren't just given the one moment of his family's torture, which was used as justification for all of his horrible actions. We went on a journey with this character, from his father's triumph and excitement to renounce their royal status, which led to them not being able to get the medical treatment needed to save his wife, and ultimately led to the impoverished citizens stringing the family up against a wall as they sought the money the family no longer had. By showing the family's aspirations and high points in their life and then leading to their downfall, I felt sympathy for the situations surrounding Doflamingo's life.
Doflamingo is a much better villain than Kaido, one of the 4 emperors. Despite Kaido being a significantly bigger threat, Kaido's personality is basically that he is near impossible to kill. He's all brawn and so far fairly boring in goals. Number 2, durable plan. The villain's plan doesn't require a single domino to fall in a certain way to send them all cascading down. They actively make their plan work and create numerous paths to victory. The best instances of these complex plans place the hero at critical moments, not by mere chance. Rather, the villain has spread false information about a fake weakness. The heroes only ruin these durable plans thanks to a moderate amount of luck and massive cooperation. This makes the hero's victory feel earned and raises the worthiness of the villain. So much so that I can't wait for their return and their next plan. When the villain's goals require a series of chance encounters, or the heroes acting with a heavy helping of hubris, they have a bad plan. In those cases, I am disappointed in how long it takes the villain to be defeated. Number 3, the villain wins. The hero may have arrested or killed the villain, but the villain gets the last laugh. In Captain America Civil War, the villain Baron Zemo won. Though captured, he ripped apart the Avengers.
Spend all that time, all that effort, to see it fail so spectacularly. Did it?
Were it not for the apocalyptic galactic force of Thanos, the Avengers would have never fully recovered. This makes Zemo a much more interesting villain than Obadiah Stane, Whiplash, Killian, or the Red Skull. Fun fact, in plotting this episode, I needed to look up the name of the Iron Man 3 villain. Aside from being played by Guy Pearce and having the stereotypical nerd haircut and awkward personality, I remembered nothing else about him. Number 4, counterbalance. I like villains who are the hero's antithesis or equal. Moriarty matches Sherlock Holmes' wits in their perpetual mind game. Loki's brains counter Thor's brawn, negating the hero's physical assets through guile and trickery. So long as the chessboard of moves and countermoves doesn't get too absurd, the villain will keep me interested. Number 5, the Mwahahas. Writing flat evildoer villains is not always a bad thing. Some stories can use cartoonishly insane villains who have goals of world domination and enjoy brutalizing plucky upstart revolutionaries. Like A Dash of Salt, use this as flavoring, best intended for mini-bosses, not the primary antagonist. Number 6. Nuance. These villains have layers. They do more than lead a death cult. They've taken up knitting, they volunteer at a dog shelter. They have a queue of shows to marathon, and yet they're also in possession of an earth-shattering doomsday device. The villain's interests and personality go well beyond murder and subjugating others. And lastly, number 7. The villain is right. Michael B. Jordan's Killmonger was such an imposing villain because his fundamental ideals were correct. Twisted by rage at his people's mistreatment, the extreme measures he took to achieve his goals were wrong, yet his core values were so valid and impactful, they changed the way the hero Black Panther viewed the world. Played by the late Chadwick Boseman, Black Panther adapted several of Killmonger's mindsets upon defeating him. These included ending Wakanda's isolation to participate with the greater world, and outreach programs for minorities in the United States. One of the hallmarks of a great villain is how much they change the hero. Thus, Killmonger was one of the best in the MCU. There you have my 7 tips for writing better, unforgettable villains. I'm Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what villains have stuck with you the most. I'm partial to Lex Luthor from the DCU cartoons in the 90s and early 2000s for his brilliant tactics and dry wit. Also, I still remember being a kid and laughing at the 90s Spider-Man cartoon when they called out the Kingpin and broke the fourth wall, claiming him as a Saturday morning cartoonish villain. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel. Join the Running to Write community on Facebook, Twitter, and all social media to share your thoughts. See you next time. Until then, create a villain worth remembering.